In a quiet little town tucked away in the Midwest, life moved at a slower pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees and neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where people liked to think nothing bad ever happened, where everyone felt safe because they trusted their local police department to keep things running smoothly. But beneath this peaceful surface lay tensions that few dared to talk about openly. FBI Captain Marcus Thompson had seen his fair share of small towns like this one during his 20-plus years of service. A decorated officer known for his sharp mind and calm demeanor, Marcus had dedicated his career to upholding justice and protecting the rights of all citizens. This time, however, his mission wasn't about catching criminals or solving high-profile cases. Instead, he'd been sent on what seemed like a routine assignment, reviewing how well the local police department complied with federal civil rights guidelines. On the morning of his visit, Marcus woke up early, dressed neatly in casual clothes, and double-checked that his FBI badge hung securely around his neck. He didn't want anyone mistaking him for anything other than who he was, a representative of the federal government there to ensure fairness and accountability. As he drove into town, he couldn't help but notice how picturesque it looked, under the soft glow of the rising sun. Everything appeared so serene, almost too perfect. When Marcus arrived at the precinct, he parked his car outside the modest brick building and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and birds chirped cheerfully nearby. For a moment he allowed himself to appreciate the simplicity of the scene before heading inside. Pushing open the heavy glass door, he entered the station, immediately, greeted by the hum of activity. Officers bustled around answering phones, typing reports, and chatting casually among themselves. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as soon as Marcus walked further into the room, he noticed something shift. Eyes turned toward him, not just briefly, but lingering stares filled with curiosity and unease. Some officers stopped mid-conversation, watching him closely as if trying to figure out why this stranger had just walked into their domain. Others exchanged quick glances, whispering behind cupped hands. Marcus wasn't unfamiliar with being watched. After all, showing up unannounced often made people nervous. Still, there was something different here, an underlying tension he couldn't quite put his finger on. Marcus approached the front desk where a young receptionist sat typing furiously on her keyboard. She looked up when she noticed him standing there, her expression flickering between confusion and mild annoyance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Yes, thank you," Marcus replied warmly, flashing a reassuring smile. "I'm Captain Marcus Thompson with the FBI. I'm here to conduct a review of your department's compliance with federal civil rights policies." The receptionist blinked, clearly caught off guard. After a brief pause, she nodded and picked up the phone to notify the sergeant on duty. While waiting, Marcus took a moment to survey the room again. His eyes scanned the walls adorned with framed commendations and photos of smiling officers posing alongside community members. On paper, this department looked exemplary, yet something about the atmosphere told him otherwise. It didn't take long for Sergeant Miller, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense attitude, to emerge from his office. He introduced himself curtly and motioned for Marcus to follow him back. As they walked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that every pair of eyes in the room followed them. Whispers grew louder, though not loud enough for him to make out specific words. Whatever these officers were saying, it wasn't friendly. Sergeant Miller led Marcus into a cramped conference room and gestured for him to sit down. "So," the sergeant began, folding his arms across his chest, "what exactly does this review entail?" Marcus explained calmly, outlining the purpose of his visit and assuring the sergeant that it was standard procedure. "We're simply ensuring that all departments are adhering to federal guidelines," he said, maintaining an even tone. "There's nothing to worry about if everything is in order." But instead of easing tensions, Marcus's words seemed to have the opposite effect. The sergeant's jaw tightened and his gaze hardened. "Well, we don't usually get visits from the feds around here," he muttered. "Hope you're not planning to stir up trouble." Before Marcus could respond, the door creaked open and another officer stepped in. Deputy Rick Hargrove was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a reputation for being hot-headed and difficult to work with. He leaned against the doorway, studying, Marcus with obvious disdain. "Who's this guy?" Hargrove asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "This is Captain Thompson from the FBI," Sergeant Miller replied tersely. "He's here to do a compliance check." Hargrove snorted derisively. "Compliance check for what? We're not doing anything wrong." His eyes narrowed as he sized Marcus up, lingering on the badge hanging around his neck. "Besides, what? Does someone like him know about our town anyway?" Marcus stiffened slightly but kept his composure. "Someone like me knows exactly what's expected of law enforcement officers across the country," he said firmly. "My job is to make sure those standards are met." For a split second, Hargrove's face twisted into a sneer, but he said nothing more. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, his presence casting a shadow over the already tense room. Marcus could feel the weight of his glare pressing down on him, but he refused to let it unnerve him. Little did he know, this encounter was only the beginning of a much larger storm brewing beneath the surface. As the meeting continued, Marcus tried to focus on gathering information and reviewing documents. But the hostility in the air was palpable. Every question he asked was met with reluctance or thinly veiled hostility. Officers dodged his inquiries, offering vague answers or outright stonewalling him. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't going to be the straightforward review he'd anticipated. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus left the conference room feeling uneasy. Something about this department, and particularly Deputy Hargrove, felt off. He reminded himself that his role was to remain professional and objective, no matter what challenges arose. What he didn't realize yet was that within hours, those challenges would escalate far beyond anything he could have imagined. As Captain Marcus Thompson stepped out of the conference room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The tension in the precinct had only grown thicker since his arrival, and it was becoming harder to ignore. Officers who had initially seemed indifferent now appeared openly hostile, their eyes following his every move. Some whispered behind their hands, while others shot him quick, disapproving glances before turning away. Marcus knew that federal reviews often made people uneasy, but this level of animosity felt personal. Deputy Rick Hargrove in particular seemed unable to let things go. After lingering at the doorway during the meeting, he now trailed Marcus like a shadow, hovering nearby whenever the FBI captain interacted with other officers or reviewed documents. His presence was suffocating, and Marcus could feel the weight of Hargrove's glare pressing down on him. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something darker, something laced with contempt. At one point, Marcus approached a desk where an officer was organizing files related to recent arrests. He asked politely if he could take a look, explaining that these records were part of the compliance review. The officer hesitated for a moment but eventually handed over the folder. Before Marcus could even open it, Hargrove stepped forward, his boots thudding loudly against the tiled floor. "What's going on here?" Hargrove demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "You think we're hiding something? You think we don't follow the rules?" Marcus turned to face him, keeping his expression calm and composed. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," he replied evenly. "I'm simply doing my job. If everything is in order, then there's nothing to worry about." Hargrove's jaw tightened and his nostrils flared. For a moment, it seemed like he might back off, but instead, he leaned closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "Your kind always comes around stirring up trouble," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Always looking for reasons to make us look bad." Marcus raised an eyebrow, choosing his words carefully. "My kind? What exactly do you mean by that?" Hargrove smirked, clearly emboldened by the attention they were attracting. Other officers began to gather around, forming a loose circle as if sensing that something was about to happen. "You know what I mean," Hargrove said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "People like you, always playing the victim, always trying to tell us how to do our jobs." The comment hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he took a deep breath and straightened his posture, ensuring his badge remained visible around his neck. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady and firm. "I'm not here because of who I am or what I look like. I'm here because it's my responsibility to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, is treated fairly under the law. That includes the officers in this department and the people they serve. For a brief moment, silence fell over the room. Even Hargrove seemed taken aback by Marcus's composure, though his surprise quickly gave way to anger. "Fairly?" he spat, taking another step closer. "You call this fair? Walking into our station, throwing your weight around, acting like you're better than us?" Marcus held up his hands slightly, palms facing outward, in a gesture meant to de-escalate the situation. "I'm not acting like I'm better than anyone," he said, his tone measured. "But if you have a problem with me being here, maybe you should ask yourself why that is." That remark struck a nerve. Hargrove's face flushed red and his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't try to turn this around on me," he snapped. "You're the one causing problems, coming in here, thinking you can boss us around just because you've got some fancy title." By now, the entire room had gone quiet, all eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Some officers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot, while others seemed to relish the drama. A few exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Marcus noticed the growing crowd but remained focused on Hargrove, determined not to let the situation spiral further out of control. "Listen," Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly in an effort to calm things down. "I'm not here to argue or pick fights. My goal is to make sure this department operates within the law. If there's no issue, then there's nothing to worry about." But Hargrove wasn't listening. His anger had reached a boiling point, and he was no longer interested in reason. "Oh, I see how it is," he sneered, his voice rising again. "Big shot FBI agent waltzes in here, thinks he knows everything. Probably never even worked a real case, huh? Just sits behind a desk pushing papers." Marcus felt a flicker of irritation but pushed it aside. He'd dealt with difficult personalities before and knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he locked eyes with Hargrove, his gaze unwavering. "If you have concerns about my qualifications, feel free to file a complaint," he said coolly. "Until then, I suggest you focus on cooperating with the review. It'll go a lot smoother for everyone involved." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive of Hargrove and others critical of his behavior. One officer muttered, "Come on, Rick, leave it alone," while another chimed in with, "This isn't helping anyone." But Hargrove ignored them, his rage consuming him entirely. He jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he growled. "Walking in here like you own the place. Well, let me tell you something. You don't belong here. Not in this town, not in this station, and certainly not giving orders to people who actually put their lives on the line every day." The words hung heavy in the air, dripping with venom. Marcus felt a surge of frustration but forced himself to remain calm. He'd faced prejudice before, both subtle and overt, but hearing it spewed so brazenly still stung. Still, he reminded himself that reacting emotionally wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he took a small step back, creating some distance between himself and Hargrove. "I'm not here to fight with you," Marcus said slowly, enunciating each word. "But I won't tolerate disrespect either. If you have a legitimate concern, we can address it professionally. Otherwise, I expect cooperation." Hargrove laughed bitterly, a sound that echoed through the tense room. "Cooperation? With you? Don't make me laugh. You wouldn't know the first thing about real police work. All you care about is ticking boxes and making us look bad." The accusation stung, but Marcus didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the other officers. Some avoided his gaze altogether, while others stared back with expressions ranging from sympathy to hostility. He realized then that this wasn't just about Hargrove. It was about the culture of the department itself. Whether intentionally or not, these officers had allowed resentment and prejudice to fester, poisoning their ability to work together effectively. Before Marcus could say anything else, Hargrove took another threatening step forward. This time his hand drifted toward the holster at his side, resting lightly on the grip of his gun. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and it sent a chill running down Marcus's spine. He froze, his mind racing. Was Hargrove really considering drawing his weapon? In a crowded precinct? Over a compliance review? The seconds stretched into eternity as the two men locked eyes, neither willing to back down. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Around them, the other officers shifted uneasily, some stepping back while others stood frozen in place. No one dared to speak, unsure of what might happen next. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more volatile, someone finally broke the silence. "Rick, stop!" a voice called out urgently. It belonged to Sergeant Miller, who had returned from his office unnoticed. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What are you doing? Put your hands where I can see them." Hargrove hesitated, his fingers still hovering near his gun. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore the order entirely. But then, reluctantly, he dropped his hand to his side and took a step back, though his eyes never left Marcus's face. The standoff had ended for now, but the damage had already been done. Marcus exhaled slowly, realizing only then that he'd been holding his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Though he'd managed to keep his composure throughout the ordeal, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a disagreement or a heated argument. It was a dangerous escalation fueled by prejudice and unchecked aggression. As Sergeant Miller ushered Hargrove away, muttering angrily under his breath, Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He knew this incident wasn't over, not by a long shot. The standoff between Captain Marcus Thompson and Deputy Rick Hargrove had reached a boiling point, and the entire precinct felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with tension, so heavy that it seemed impossible for anyone to move or speak without shattering the fragile calm. Marcus stood frozen in place, his hand slightly raised in a gesture of de-escalation, though his mind raced with thoughts about what could happen next. He'd faced dangerous situations before during his long career with the FBI, but this was different. This wasn't an armed suspect or a high-stakes raid. It was supposed to be a routine compliance review, something as mundane as filling out paperwork. Yet here he was, staring down the barrel of potential violence simply because of who he was. Deputy Hargrove's hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered gun, his fingers twitching as if itching to draw it. His face was flushed red with anger, his jaw clenched so tightly that Marcus could see the muscles working beneath his skin. Hargrove's eyes burned with a mix of rage and defiance, daring Marcus or anyone else to challenge him further. Around them, the other officers were frozen too, their expressions ranging from shock to fear to quiet resignation. Some looked away, unwilling to witness what might unfold, while others watched wide-eyed, unable to tear their gaze from the scene. Sergeant Miller's voice broke through the suffocating silence again, louder this time, commanding attention. "Hargrove, I said step back," he barked, his tone firm and authoritative. But even as he spoke, there was a hint of desperation in his voice, as though he feared he wouldn't be able to stop what was coming. For a moment, it seemed like Hargrove might ignore the order entirely. His body tensed, and his breathing grew, heavier, each exhale sharp and audible. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers curled tighter around the grip of his weapon. Time slowed to a crawl as everyone in the room realized what was happening. It wasn't just posturing anymore. Hargrove was seriously considering drawing his gun. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let panic take over. Instead, he focused on keeping his movements slow and deliberate, ensuring that nothing he did could be misinterpreted as aggressive. He locked eyes with Hargrove, trying to convey calmness despite the storm raging inside him. "Deputy Hargrove," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't necessary. Let's talk this out." But Hargrove wasn't listening. His lips curled into a sneer, and he leaned forward slightly, his stance shifting into something more threatening. "Talk? You think talking is going to fix anything?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "You come in, here acting like you're better than us, throwing your badge around and expect us to roll over? Well, guess what? I'm not rolling over for anyone. The room erupted into murmurs, some officers pleading with Hargrove to stand down while others muttered under their breath about how this whole situation was spiraling out of control. One officer stepped forward hesitantly, her voice trembling, as she addressed Hargrove. "Rick, please, don't do this. Think about what you're doing." But Hargrove brushed her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his focus never wavering for Marcus. "This doesn't concern you." Marcus knew he had to act fast. If Hargrove drew his weapon, things could escalate beyond repair in an instant. He glanced around the room, again, searching for any sign of support or intervention. Most of the officers looked paralyzed, unsure whether to intervene or simply stay out of the way. A few exchanged nervous glances, silently debating whether they should step in. Meanwhile, Sergeant Miller continued to shout orders, his voice rising in desperation. "Hargrove, put your hands where we can see them." Miller commanded again, his own hand hovering near his holster now. "Do it now, or I swear—" "Or what?" Hargrove interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You'll arrest me? Go ahead, try it. See how far that gets you." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. He knew that showing fear would only embolden Hargrove further. "Deputy," he said, his tone steady and measured, "you're making a mistake. Nobody wants this to end badly. Not you, not me, and certainly not your colleagues. Just take a step back and let's resolve this peacefully." But Hargrove wasn't interested in peace. His grip tightened on his weapon, and for a split second, Marcus thought he saw the glint of steel as Hargrove began to pull the gun free from its holster. The movement sent a ripple of panic through the room, and several officers instinctively stepped back, creating more space between themselves and the escalating confrontation. Then suddenly, Hargrove stopped. His arm remained partially extended, the butt of his gun visible now, but he didn't fully draw it. Instead, he pointed it directly at Marcus, holding it loosely at his side. The message was clear. "Back off, or else." Marcus froze, his mind racing. He knew that moving suddenly could provoke Hargrove into firing, but standing still left him vulnerable. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to react, to defend himself, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. His training kicked in, reminding him that survival depended on staying calm and assessing the situation rationally. Still, it was hard to ignore the cold reality of the weapon aimed at him, the weight of its presence pressing down on his chest. Around them, the room erupted into chaos. Officers shouted at Hargrove to lower his weapon, while others scrambled toward phones or radios calling for backup. Someone yelled, "This is insane," while another pleaded, "Rick, don't ruin your life over this." The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of voices blending together in panic and confusion. Yet through it all, Marcus kept his focus squarely on Hargrove, refusing to look away. "You've got one chance to walk away from this," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "Lower your weapon, and we can settle this, like professionals. But if you pull that trigger, there's no going back." Hargrove hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. For all his bravado, he seemed to realize the gravity of what he was doing. Drawing a weapon on a federal agent wasn't just reckless, it was criminal. And yet pride and anger warred within him, clouding his judgment. His finger twitched against the grip of his gun, and Marcus braced himself for the worst. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any tenser, a new voice cut through the commotion. "What's going on here?" It belonged to Officer Daniels, a younger woman who had been quietly observing from the sidelines until now. She stepped forward cautiously, her hands raised in a gesture of neutrality. "Rick, listen to me. You're crossing a line. Put the gun down before someone gets hurt." Her words seemed to pierce through Hargrove's haze of anger. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon, though he didn't holster it completely. His breathing was ragged, and sweat trickled down his forehead, but the immediate threat appeared to have passed. For a brief moment, the room exhaled collectively, the tension easing ever so slightly. Marcus didn't relax, however. He knew that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. Hargrove was still armed, and the hostility in the room remained palpable. Any sudden movement could reignite the confrontation, and Marcus wasn't willing to gamble with his life, or anyone else's. Instead, he kept his hands up, maintaining the same posture of non-aggression. "I'm going to need you to secure that weapon, Deputy," Marcus said firmly, his voice cutting through the lingering chaos. "Now." Hargrove glared at him, his chest heaving with exertion. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse. But then, with a growl of frustration, he finally holstered his gun, though not without shooting Marcus one last venomous look. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. As the immediate crisis abated, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Officers exchanged wary glances, some visibly shaken by what they'd witnessed. Sergeant Miller approached Hargrove, his face pale with fury and disbelief. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with barely contained rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hargrove didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the precinct, underscoring the gravity of what had just happened. Marcus watched him go, his mind racing with questions. What came next? Would Hargrove face consequences for his actions? Or would the department sweep this incident under the rug, chalking it up to a momentary lapse in judgment? As the adrenaline began to ebb, Marcus allowed himself a moment to process everything. He'd come to this small town expecting nothing more than a routine review. Yet here he was, standing in the aftermath of a potentially deadly confrontation. The experience left him shaken, but also resolute. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he couldn't back down, not when lives and principles hung in the balance. The tension in the precinct began to shift almost immediately after Deputy Rick Hargrove stormed out of the room. While his departure had temporarily diffused the explosive confrontation, it did little to ease the unease that lingered in the air. Officers exchanged nervous glances, some whispering quietly among themselves while others stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The gravity of what had just happened was sinking in for everyone present, including Sergeant Miller, whose face was pale and drawn as he tried to regain control of the situation. Marcus Thompson remained where he stood, his hands still slightly raised, though no longer in a defensive posture. His heart rate was finally beginning to slow, but his mind was racing. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. What had just transpired wasn't merely an argument or a heated exchange. It was a dangerous escalation fueled by prejudice and unchecked aggression. And now, the entire department, and perhaps the town itself, would have to grapple with the fallout. Sergeant Miller turned to Marcus, his expression a mix of frustration and apology. "Captain Thompson," he began, his voice strained. I don't even know what to say. That shouldn't have happened. Not here, not like this." Marcus nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's clear there are some serious issues within this department," he said evenly. "But right now we need to focus on de-escalating the situation before things get worse." Miller ran a hand through his thinning hair, clearly overwhelmed. "You're right," he muttered. "I'll make sure Hargrove is dealt with appropriately. In the meantime..." He trailed off, looking around at the other officers who were still milling about uncertainly. "Everyone, back to your posts. This isn't helping anyone." Though officers hesitated for a moment, reluctant to leave the scene of such a dramatic incident, but eventually they began to disperse, returning to their desks or stepping outside to clear their heads. Some shot furtive glances at Marcus as they passed, their expressions unreadable. Were they sympathetic, scared, resentful? It was impossible to tell. Marcus kept his gaze steady, refusing to let his guard down completely. He couldn't afford to appear weak, not when tensions were still so high. As the room emptied, Sergeant Miller approached Marcus again, his tone softer this time. "Look, I know you didn't come here expecting any of this," he said. "And I want you to know that Hargrove doesn't speak for all of us. Most of the people here take their jobs seriously and care about doing the right thing." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "But actions speak louder than words, Sergeant." If this department wants to prove it's committed to fairness and accountability, then real changes need to happen, not just lip service. Miller nodded grimly, knowing deep down that Marcus was right. Before he could respond further, however, another officer hurried into the room, her face flushed with urgency. "Sir," she exclaimed, addressing Miller directly, "we've got state troopers pulling up outside. They're asking for Captain Thompson." Marcus felt a surge of relief wash over him. Backup had arrived, though whether it would help or complicate matters remained to be seen. Either way, reinforcements meant he wasn't alone in navigating this volatile situation. He glanced at Miller, who looked equally surprised, but also visibly relieved. Perhaps having outside authorities step in would force the department to confront its problems head-on rather than brushing them under the rug. "Let's go meet them," Marcus said, gesturing toward the door. Together, he and Miller stepped outside, where several marked vehicles were parked haphazardly near the entrance. State troopers poured out of their cars, clad in full uniform and carrying an air of authority that demanded respect. Leading the group was Trooper Commander Laura Hayes, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper demeanor. She scanned the scene quickly, taking in the tense atmosphere before locking eyes with Marcus. "Captain Thompson?" she asked, stepping forward. When Marcus nodded, she extended a hand. "Commander Hayes, State Police Division. We received reports of a potentially dangerous situation involving one of your officers. Can you fill me in?" Marcus shook her hand firmly, grateful for her professionalism. "Thank you for coming, Commander," he said. "Deputy Rick Hargrove drew his weapon on me during a compliance review. Thankfully, no shots were fired, but the situation escalated dangerously before Sergeant Miller intervened." Hayes's brow furrowed as she processed the information. Turning to Miller, she asked pointedly, "Is this true, Sergeant?" Miller swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted reluctantly. "Hargrove became agitated during the review and, well, things got out of hand. I'm handling it internally, but obviously, given the circumstances, external oversight may be necessary." Hayes nodded, her expression unreadable. "Understood. Where is Deputy Hargrove now?" "He left shortly after holstering his weapon," Marcus explained. "I believe he went home, but I can provide details if needed." Without hesitation, Hayes turned to one of her troopers. "Dispatch a unit to locate and detain Deputy Hargrove immediately," she ordered. "Inform him he's under arrest pending investigation. And secure the premises. No one leaves until we've gathered statements and reviewed available footage." The trooper saluted sharply and moved to carry out her orders, while Hayes turned her attention back to Marcus and Miller. "Captain Thompson, I'd like to hear your account of what happened firsthand. Sergeant, you'll accompany us as well. Let's move inside." As they re-entered the precinct, Marcus couldn't help but notice how the mood had shifted yet again. Officers who had been trying to act normal moments earlier now looked visibly anxious, aware that the stakes had risen significantly. Commanders and investigators from both the state police and federal agencies began streaming in, setting up equipment to collect evidence and interview witnesses. Body cameras were confiscated, surveillance footage reviewed, and notes taken meticulously. The once quiet station buzzed with activity, transforming into the epicenter of a major investigation. For Marcus, the whirlwind of events was surreal. One moment he'd been conducting a routine review. The next he was at the center of a crisis that threatened to expose deep-seated issues within law enforcement. As he recounted the details of the confrontation to Commander Hayes, he found himself reflecting on the broader implications of what had occurred. This wasn't just about Hargrove. It was about the culture that allowed someone like him to act with impunity. It was about systemic failures that perpetuated bias and hostility, creating environments where incidents like this could occur. Meanwhile, Sergeant Miller sat nearby, listening intently as Marcus spoke. His expression was a mixture of guilt and determination, as though he realized the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. At one point, he leaned forward and addressed Hayes directly. "Commander, I understand the severity of this situation," he said earnestly. "And I assure you I'll cooperate fully with your investigation. Whatever needs to be done to ensure justice is served, I'll support it." Hayes regarded him coolly, her tone measured but firm. "That's good to hear, Sergeant, because trust me, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Every officer involved will be held accountable for their actions, or lack thereof." By late afternoon, news of the incident had begun to spread beyond the confines of the precinct. Word traveled quickly in small towns, and soon, curious residents gathered outside the station, whispering amongst themselves. Some expressed outrage at Hargrove's behavior, while others defended him, claiming he'd been provoked. Social media lit up with speculation, and local reporters descended on the scene, eager to capture sound bites and footage. Through it all, Marcus maintained his composure, focusing on the task at hand. He answered questions patiently, reviewed documents thoroughly, and ensured that every piece of evidence was preserved. Despite the chaos swirling around him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding one rogue deputy accountable. It was about shining a light on the cracks in the system and working toward meaningful change. As evening fell and the initial flurry of activity began to wind down, Marcus took a moment to step outside for some fresh air. The cool breeze helped clear his mind, allowing him to reflect on everything that had transpired. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback, and attempts to discredit him or minimize the significance of the incident. But he also knew that moments like these, moments of reckoning, were opportunities to drive progress. Standing there under the fading light, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. For too long, voices calling for reform had been ignored or silenced. But tonight, in this quiet Midwest town, something had shifted. The world was watching, and the pressure for accountability was mounting. Whether the department liked it or not, change was coming, and Marcus intended to be part of it. As night fell over the small Midwest town, the story of what had happened inside the precinct began to spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up on the incident almost immediately, thanks in part to social media posts from witnesses and curious onlookers who had gathered outside the station earlier in the day. By morning, the confrontation between FBI Captain Marcus Thompson and Deputy Rick Hargrove was headline news across local, regional, and even national platforms. The details varied depending on the source. Some reports focused on the explosive nature of the standoff, while others emphasized the racial undertones that seemed impossible to ignore. What remained consistent, however, was the core narrative. A decorated federal agent had been threatened at gunpoint by a local police officer during what should have been a routine compliance review. The implications were staggering, and public reaction was swift and polarized. On one side of the debate were those who supported Marcus, hailing him as a symbol of resilience and professionalism in the face of blatant prejudice. Social media hashtags like Arthur's Justice for Marcus and Darcer Accountability now began trending, with users sharing messages of solidarity and demanding action against Deputy Hargrove and any officers complicit in allowing such behavior to go unchecked. Protesters started gathering outside the precinct, holding signs that read "Protect our protectors" and "No more excuses." Many saw this as yet another example of systemic racism within law enforcement, a reminder that progress was still desperately needed. On the other side were voices defending Hargrove, claiming he had simply been doing his job and reacting to an outsider questioning the integrity of his department. Some argued that Marcus's presence itself had been provocative, suggesting that federal reviews undermined the authority of local officers. These sentiments gained traction among certain segments of the community, particularly those skeptical of government oversight or resistant to discussions about racial bias. Online forums became battlegrounds, with heated arguments erupting over whether Hargrove's actions were justified or if they represented a deeper cultural problem. Amidst the chaos, leaked footage of the incident only added fuel to the fire. A grainy video clip, captured by a body camera worn by one of the officers present, showed Hargrove drawing his weapon and pointing it directly at Marcus. His harsh words and dismissive tone were clearly audible, leaving little room for interpretation. The clip went viral within hours, amassing millions of views and sparking outrage worldwide. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. A sworn officer of the law behaving in such a reckless and hostile manner toward a fellow law enforcement official. For Marcus, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. He'd always preferred staying behind the scenes, letting his work speak for itself rather than seeking attention. But now, he found himself thrust into the center of a national conversation about race, policing, and accountability. Reporters camped outside his temporary lodgings, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or snag an exclusive interview. Activists reached out, asking him to join rallies or speak at events advocating for reform. Friends and colleagues checked in, offering support but also urging caution, knowing how quickly public opinion could shift. Despite the pressure, Marcus tried to maintain perspective. He knew the real battle wouldn't be fought in front of cameras or on social media. It would happen in courtrooms, legislative chambers, and community meetings. Still, he couldn't deny the significance of the moment. For years, critics of law enforcement misconduct had struggled to gain traction, often dismissed as exaggerating isolated incidents or playing the victim. Now here was undeniable proof of the very issues they'd been warning about, a tangible example of how unchecked bias and hostility could escalate into life-threatening situations. As the days passed, the protests grew larger and more organized. Community leaders partnered with civil rights organizations to plan marches and vigils, calling not just for justice in this specific case but for broader reforms aimed at addressing systemic inequities. Local schools held assemblies to discuss the incident, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and respect. Even businesses got involved, with some owners posting signs in their windows declaring their support for accountability and equality. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere remained tense. Officers divided along predictable lines, some openly criticizing Hargrove's actions and calling for transparency, while others defended him and resented the scrutiny being placed on their department. Sergeant Miller worked tirelessly to keep morale intact, though it was clear he was walking a tightrope. On one hand, he needed to ensure cooperation with investigators. On the other, he had to manage growing resentment among his team. Rumors circulated that several officers were considering resigning, feeling disillusioned by the negative attention and fear of potential repercussions. Meanwhile, legal proceedings began moving forward. Hargrove was formally charged with multiple offenses, including assault with a deadly weapon, obstruction of justice, and violating civil rights laws. His arrest made headlines once again, reigniting debates about appropriate punishment for someone in his position. Should he face harsher penalties because of his role as a law enforcement officer? Or should mitigating factors, like alleged provocation or stress, be taken into account? Defense attorneys wasted no time crafting their strategy, portraying Hargrove as a man pushed to his limits by an intrusive federal review process. They argued that his actions, while regrettable, stemmed from frustration rather than malice. Prosecutors countered by presenting evidence of Hargrove's history of controversial behavior, painting him as someone whose prejudices had long gone unaddressed. Audio recordings surfaced of past interactions where Hargrove had used racially charged language, further damaging his credibility. Throughout all of this, Marcus remained steadfast. When called upon to testify during pretrial hearings, he recounted the events calmly and objectively, refusing to let emotions cloud his testimony. His composure earned him praise from both supporters and skeptics alike, reinforcing his reputation as a professional committed to upholding the law without bias or favoritism. Yet despite his outward resolve, Marcus wasn't immune to the emotional toll of the situation. Late at night, when the noise subsided and he was alone with his thoughts, he replayed the incident over and over in his mind. He thought about the split second when Hargrove's finger twitched near the trigger, wondering how close he'd come to becoming another statistic in America's long history of violence against marginalized communities. It was sobering and motivating. If anything good was to come from this ordeal, Marcus vowed it would be meaningful change, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by similar injustices. By the time the initial wave of media frenzy began to settle, the incident had already left an indelible mark on the town and beyond. Conversations about policing, accountability, and racial equity were no longer confined to academic circles or activist groups. They had entered mainstream discourse, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. Businesses implemented diversity training programs, schools revised curricula to include lessons on systemic inequality, and lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing oversight of law enforcement agencies. For Marcus, the experience was transformative. While he never sought to become a public figure, he recognized the unique opportunity he now had to influence positive change. Whether through testifying in court, speaking at community events, or collaborating with advocacy groups, he embraced his role as a catalyst for reform. And though challenges lay ahead, he felt hopeful that moments like these, however painful, could pave the way for a brighter, fairer future.